Wrecked on Island Number 10 by Anonymous. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wrecked on Island Number 10 by Anonymous from All the Year Round, Volume 7, Magazine Number 161, 24th May 1862. I can't stand this any longer, Ned. I shall turn out and go on deck. This stifling heat is bad enough to bear without the stings of the confounded mosquitoes. I could as soon sleep in a kiln with a blister all over me. I scrambled out of my berth and huddled on my clothes as well as the dim light would allow. The other occupant of the little cabin, my dear old friend and kinsman, Ned Granger, merely yawned and stretched himself. Petty annoyances did not trouble him. He had been sleeping as contentedly as if the villainous little den of a cabin close to the engine which we had been talked into hiring on board the Van Buren were a cool and airy bedchamber. We had both been outwitted by the steamboat clerk, a smart citizen, who had assured us on his honor that the only disposable cabin left on board the Mississippi packet was a snug and pleasant one, free from bugs and cockroaches, and not in the least too hot. And now I was stewed and stung to the verge of fever, while Ned, whom nothing seemed to hurt, turned over on his pillow with a little sigh, murmuring, "Take it coolly, old chap. You'll forget the temperature and the gnats when we get to Cairo and have our breakfast ashore. Take it coolly." I replied rather testily that I wished I could, but that not being a salamander I couldn't, and with this withering retort I left the cabin and stumbled my way on deck. The hurricane deck of an American river steamer is a gay scene by day, but it had a melancholy and lonely look as I saw it in the feeble moonlight, bare and deserted. The pilot in his lofty wheelhouse, intent upon the helm and the bearings, and a solitary deckhand who filled the office of lookout, appeared to be the only human beings awake save myself. To be sure, from the hatchway of the engine room there gushed at times a transient glare of dull crimson firelight, and a pitch-black figure crossed the gleam, while a sound as of the dull roaring of a caged wild beast told that the furnace had been supplied with fresh wood. It was very hot and sultry even in the air, but the atmosphere was endurable when compared with the oven-like oppression of the heat below. The mosquitoes were still troublesome, but I felt that I could bear their sharp stings better than when I lay in the close cabin. I leaned over the side rail and gazed upon the yellow river, whose turbid waters stretched for an immense distance on either hand. The moon was new and pale, but I could make out the bold bluffs of the Tennessee shore, though the low-lying forest of the Missouri bank was hid in dark shadow. "'Tis lonesome here, mister, ain't it?" drawled out a nasal voice at my elbow. I could not help starting. "I didn't mean to scare you, Mr. Barham," apologized the voice, which I now recognize as that of an American passenger, General Jeremiah Flint, who had taken a fancy to Ned Granger and myself, and with whom we had struck up a traveling friendship. General Flint was a thoroughbred Yankee, one of those tall, leafy, dark-browed down-easters who are found in active employment all over the Union. His complete history, of which he now and then favored us with piquant scraps, would have been very amusing even in print, and partook a good deal of the adventurous ups and downs in the career of Hadji Baba. Just now the General was at rather a low pitch of the social seesaw, being on board the boat in no more exalted capacity than that of traveling salesman to a jobber of dry goods at Philadelphia. General Flint was not, and never had been, a military man. He had been Postmaster General of some small state, Vermont or Maine, and had retained the latter and more portable half of his quondam official designation.
"It's kinder dull up here, but I couldn't sleep," said the newcomer. "I've got it happened home upon my mind to-night that mischief's on the brew."
"On the what?" said I, laughing.
"On the brew, sir,"
answered the General very solemnly.
"Young men like you, Mr. Barham, air too apt to ridicule the presentiments of their elders. But Jeremy Flint's no greenhorn, and he don't relish the feel of matters."
I had observed before that the General was a little oracular, and, what may seem odder in a Yankee, slightly superstitious. But I knew he was a keen practical person, who had seen 10 times as much of the world as I, an ex-Oxonian of 4 and 20, could possibly have done. Therefore, when my queer acquaintance seemed ill at ease, I strongly suspected that his prognostications of coming evil were based on other grounds than those of sentiment.
"I'll let you know, mister, the long and short of it," said the Yankee, dropping his voice. "This Van Buren we're afloat in is an old craft, old and leaky, and clean wore out from her keelson to her boiler. That's just truth. The owners held a talk about giving her up, they did, a month ago, but old Barnabas Kyle, senior partner, said hold on, she's good for a voyage or two, and if she breaks up, the fixings are no loss. Let her rip."
"Do you mean to say that the owners have permitted this boat to sail knowing she was unsafe? If so, and harm happens, it is murder." The General nodded.
"That's a European idea, sir. I don't say I approve of what old Kyle's done, but it's common enough. Still, this child wishes he were in his boots, and his boots ashore he does." And the American drummed the devil's tattoo on the side rail with his long bony fingers. I asked whereabouts we were. I knew that Flint was familiar with every bend of the river. "We're past New Madrid,"
he answered, scanning the shoreline sharply.
"And we're going mortal slow for all our puffing and straining. Let me see, that's Red Bluff on the Tennessee bank, and yon dark line on the larboard must be island number 10.
As if the words had been the sounds of some fearful spell, there was at that instant a roar as loud as the roar of 100 cannon, a crash of breaking timber and riven ironwork, and the deck was torn into splintered fragments, while fire, shattered beams, and scalding vapor came spouting up as from a volcano. I was struggling with the cold waters of the Mississippi, which bubbled and hissed in my ears as the strong current sucked me downstream. What had happened I hardly knew. I was stunned and deafened, but I fought for life with mechanical energy, and, being able to swim, could just keep myself above the surface. My wet clothes and boots embarrassed me, and the stream was too strong to be resisted, but just as I felt myself being swept away like a leaf upon the river, I jostled against a floating mass of woodwork and clutched it.
"Give me your fingers, whoever you are!"
cried a familiar voice, and a strong hand caught my wrist.
"Mr. Barham, by all that's earthly! Well, I am glad to see you alive, Britisher. Get hold of the beam and scramble up where I am."
General Flint assisted me to crawl to the top of the floating timber, where he sat at ease with his feet dangling in the water.
"'Tain't first time this child has seen a boiler bust. Apple quiltings, I thought it would be a final smash. The notions I was taking back to Philadelphia were all well insured, that's one comfort, and my notes are in my waistband."
"Boiler burst? Then the boiler did burst, and we're alone? The rest of us? Ned Granger?"
"There's not much moon, but you may make out the hull of the steamer afloat yet," said the Yankee. "What's left of her, drifting like a floating coffin. If there's any living human being aboard her, drowning will be welcome, after the misery they're in, I guess. The water and steam did scald, I reckon."
A dull pain in my hands attracted my notice. I looked down and could see that they were swollen and red. I remember that I had grasped the side rail at the moment of the explosion, and I had no doubt that I had been partially injured by the dash of heated water from which Flint seemed wholly to have escaped. I do not recollect what followed. I heard Flint's voice very indistinctly, a mere humming of meaningless words, and I rocked to and fro from weakness. My brain reeled. Then I grew sick and faint, and I remember being in deadly fear lest I should tumble off the spar. I remember, too, trying to call to my companion for help, but failing to speak intelligibly. And then I remember no more until I was lying on a heap of brushwood ashore, and Flint was insinuating between my lips some drops of whiskey from a metal flask.
"Cheer up, Britisher, you'll do now. It kinder came over you," said the good-natured Yankee, lifting the flask to his own lips and imbibing several sups of the cordial. I gave his hand a feeble squeeze. "I owe you my life. But where are we? And Ned, are any saved?" The Yankee shook his head. "We're on island number 10, that's where we are. Just after you gave in we grounded, and I got a grip of a snag sticking out of the mud, and we're on dry earth again. If you're strong enough, mister, we'd best look for a shelter, for 'tain't wholesome to lie out so far south." I was bruised and weak, and my hands were very painful, but I could walk pretty well. We made our way across a sort of swampy meadow, the General talking rapidly and continually, in his kindly wish to divert my thoughts from the sad fate of my gallant cousin. I gathered from him that the island had no permanent inhabitants, but was occasionally frequented by ferrymen, flatmen, and others, at the particular seasons when their trades were in full activity. General Flint scarcely fancied that we should find any living possessors of this dreary spot, but he made no doubt we should discover some log-house in tolerable repair, where we could pass the night. "And in the morning, mister, we'll signal a steamboat and get picked off. No fear of our playing Robinson Crusoe too long here, I guess. We'll have a banyan breakfast, but our appetite for dinner will be a caution to alligators. Ah, here's a convenient location."
In effect, we were on the threshold of a large and substantial log-house, behind which we could dimly discern the outlines of other buildings. The heavy door was ajar, and yielded sullenly to our push. We entered. The interior was, of course, quite dark, but a feeble red glow proceeded from some dying embers on the hearth, proving that human beings had been there within a few hours. The General showed no surprise. He merely observed that a timber flat, bound for New Orleans, had probably run aground on the island, and wished the men had remained, that they might have given us a cast ashore in their Broadhorn. He stooped, blew the embers to a glow, laid on dry bush and fresh wood, and soon the hut was illuminated by a cheery glare. It was large, in good repair, and contained an old table of unbarked wood, and several broken barrels which had probably served for seats. There were shelves nailed up, but they were empty, nor were any provisions visible. But in an inner recess, half partitioned off from the larger apartment, were several heaps of brushwood and flowery grasses, beds not to be despised when mattresses and pillows were out of the question. I do not suppose that Jeremiah Flint had ever heard of the French proverb, qui dort dîne, but he showed some sagacity in remarking that when asleep our foodless and comfortless state would be less vexatious. We dried our clothes before the large fire, and prepared to obtain such repose as we might in the inner compartment of the cabin. General Flint had been, in the course of his adventurous life, accustomed to queer sleeping places, and it was with a grunt of satisfaction that he adjusted his bony frame to the heaps of withering brush.
"Pull some of them sassafras boughs over your face, mister. That's the way to cheat the skeeters," said he. "We'll have a good long nap, and wake up in time to hoist a handkercher on one of those hemlocks down by the waterside. If a steamer don't see it, a flatboat may."
I lay still a few moments, and then rolled restlessly from side to side. My nerves were strung to a painful tension, and my brain was too active to allow sleep to visit me. The accident, with all its horrors, rather imagined than actually seen, was ever before my eyes, but it seemed unreal and unnatural, a vivid nightmare rather than a sad reality. Poor Ned Granger, too. What sad news to carry home to the quiet Devonshire rectory, where father, mother, and sisters were hopefully awaiting his return. To die so early, and by a death so horrible and abrupt, how should I ever dare to tell it? Poor dear Ned, who saved my life once, who had done me 50 kindnesses, with whom I had never exchanged an angry word. Where should I ever again in life find such a friend as that early one now lost? How long I mused I cannot tell, but I was startled by a sound which broke the stillness of the night, a very odd sound to be heard on island number 10, the neigh of a horse. I shook off my reverie and half raised myself to listen. The sound was not renewed, but so sure was I that it had been no cheat of fancy that I determined to rouse my companion and solve the doubt. It was not until I had shaken Flint, who was a heavy sleeper, that he woke up grumbling.
"Jerusalem, mister, what's afloat? Not a bar swum across, surely?"
"No," said I, rather ashamed, "only the neighing of a horse, close at hand."
"Unpossible. Couldn't be. There's no horse beasts here. What should they be doing on the island? You must have been dreaming, Mr. Barham."
The General yawned and sank back into the pile of brushwood, nor was it long before his heavy breathing announced that he was fast asleep. I was far from convinced, but I was puzzled. Imagination, I knew, does often play us strange tricks. Besides, was it not possible that a horse had neighed on shore, on either the left or right bank, and that my ear, perhaps unusually acute after the excitement of the night, had caught and exaggerated the distant sound? I pondered yet a while, but I was weary. Gradually my nerves relaxed, my eyelids became heavy, and I sank into deep slumber. Not so deep, however, but that my dreams were stirring and various, changing like the shifting patterns of a kaleidoscope. One dream was particularly distinct. I have forgotten it now, but I know that a conversation between ideal personages attracted my fullest attention, and that by degrees this conversation grew more and more real and audible.
"I don't care a cuss how it kept alight," said someone. "Just clap on a couple more sticks and I'll blow up the kindlers."
Directly afterwards I heard the familiar noise, familiar at least to one fresh from prairie travel, of somebody blowing the embers of a fire into a blaze, while the sharp crackle of burning wood succeeded.
"Where's Stone's marm?"
asked someone else in a high cracked voice that contrasted with the deep tones of the first speaker.
"Where's the old critter got to, I admire? I'm as starved for one as any wolf, and there's never a scrap to eat until she broils the meat. 10 hours' work makes a man peckish, and we must clear out of this before day."
Vaguely the thought dawned in my half unconscious mind that I was no longer asleep, and that the words I heard were real words spoken by beings of flesh and blood. I opened my eyes. The larger compartment of the log house was suffused with dull red light, which brightened into a clearer glow as the wood, heaped on the fire with a lavish hand, caught the ascending blaze. Around this fire were grouped 5 or 6 men, most of whom wore the red flannel shirts and coarse homespun of the regular Mississippi working garb. though one was in a suit of rusty black of city make. Several more dark figures hovered about the open doorway, going and coming, bringing bags and barrels, which were received by two of the men within. Boatmen, thought I, who had probably put in for a safe haven when benighted on the rapid and dangerous river. I was preparing to accost them, when a shrill neighing, unmistakably that of a horse this time and close by, was answered as shrilly and distinctly by an equine companion.
"Darn them brutes, pinch their nostrils, you loafing dunces, or if a steamer goes by the place will be blown upon,"
said the deep and fierce voice from the hut, and the man whom I had not observed sprang up from a sitting posture and strode across the illuminated space. I rubbed my eyes and cautiously raised myself on my elbow. The last speaker was of gigantic stature, with a fell of shaggy black hair tumbling on the collar of his red woolen shirt. His face was a stern and forbidding one, like that of some robber soldier in a Flemish picture. He wore a pistol and a bowie knife, ostentatiously displayed in the black leather belt around his waist. "All right, Captain. 'Twas that rampaging black beast, Jem Hudson's colt, that got loose a minute," answered a man from without, and very soon several men and 2 or 3 women entered the log house. Most of the newcomers were ruffianly figures with the brass-bound handles of knives and pistols peeping out of their pockets or protruding from the breasts of their homespun coats. But 1 or 2 had the air of educated men, though their keen faces showed traces of evil passions and evil habits. One old man, he must have been more than 60, was well dressed in the unpretending garments of a respectable western farmer, and his weather-beaten but mild face contrasted with the ferocity and recklessness of the countenances around him. The man with the high cracked voice, who wore a town-made suit of dilapidated broadcloth, accosted this newcomer as Mr. Stone, and asked if his wife intended to give the company any supper or not. "The missus is coming in. You'd best ask her," said the old farmer, philosophically lighting his pipe. Mrs. Stone, a tall bony virago, here bustled forward to answer for herself, which she did by telling the hungry querist that he was "a greedy, cowardly, troublesome turkey buzzard of a Yankee, and that he had better have been helping to cacher the horses and unload the boats than calling for food as if he was in some fine city hotel." While this upbraiding the man in black, who indeed seemed to hold a very low position in the esteem of his comrades, Mrs. Stone bustled furiously to and fro, and before long a great frying pan full of pieces of pork was sputtering on the fire, while several junks of beef and venison were broiling on impromptu spits made of ramrods stuck in the soft clay of the floor. Mrs. Stone was aided in these culinary processes by a pretty modest-looking girl of 18, whose pale sad face looked out of keeping with the place and company, and whom I discovered to be her eldest daughter. A younger girl, about 14 years of age, looked on from the outer circle. I no longer felt the slightest inclination to address the members of this group, and hardly knew in what light to consider them. I could form no guess as to their calling or object, but I instinctively cowered down among the branches and hid myself from observation. I felt that something was amiss, and that discovery might lead to awkward results. General Flint was asleep, but I feared that every moment he might awake and utter some exclamation, while it was always possible that his heavy breathing might draw the attention of some sharp-eared member of the band. Some of the party had seated themselves on barrels or logs, with every sign of fatigue, but the rest stood watching the pork as it bubbled in the pan, and the steaks browning before the fierce fire. Several voices were speaking at once, and I only caught unconnected scraps of the talk. "Jem Hudson was terrible riled. He set such a value on that colt.
If his gun hadn't had too much powder in it, this child would have been a gone coon, I guess. I think Hiram Stout's a deal uglier than Jim. He owes us a grudge, he does. I reckon Tennessee's getting too hot to hold us." "Keep your opinion till it's asked for, Greenhorn," said the big man who had been addressed as captain, and who spoke in a tone of bullying authority. "This nigger don't need a Pennsylvania chicken to tell him when a melon squash is squeezed dry."
"Here's your victuals ready, and no lady in Illinois State could have fixed 'em better nor yet slicker," exclaimed Mrs. Stone in an argumentative manner as if to challenge contradiction. But nobody picked up the gauntlet. A circle was formed, some walnut wood platters and pewter pannikins were produced from a hiding place, the company drew their bowie knives, and Mrs. Stone carried round the frying pan in order that every one might help himself, while her two daughters followed, one with the stakes still stuck upon the iron-tipped ramrods, the other with some lumps of cornbread in a basket. It was at this moment that I felt my wrist cautiously grasped by a set of long, lean fingers, and could hardly repress an exclamation when, looking round, I saw that Jeremiah Flint was awake and had risen to a kneeling position, keeping at the same time well behind the screen of brushwood.
"It's well I woke. We're in a fix, Mr. Ware."
I looked round. I could see by the faint light that my companion's resolute face was very pale.
"Very bad, this. Worse than scalding water, maybe. We've got into the den of a grizzly, mister, and if we carry our scalps out, we may be thankful of you."
I began to be seriously alarmed. I was yet in ignorance as to the true character of those on whose bounds we seemed to be unwitting trespassers. But I knew that Flint, who had spent years in the Wild West, had a stout heart, and that his apprehensions were not likely to be roused without reason.
"I know more than one of 'em, Mr. Barham,"
whispered the General.
"That tall fishhod of a man in the tailcoat comes from Concord, Mass. He was a regular penitentiary bird, he was. That German rogue in the cap is Fritz Vogel, who was nigh hanged at Chicago last fall. And, may I never, but that big chap in the red shirt, the captain, turns out to be the Black Dave."
"Black Dave?"
"Aye, Black Dave, or David Jossum, the most eternal thief. Famous for stealing horses, coining bogus dollars, robbing stores, and breaking out of prison. Last time I saw him was at Little Rock, Arkansas, in the Supreme Court on the trial, and but for a rogue of a lawyer."
Here my friend's reminiscences were cut short by the abrupt question put by a gentleman whose mouth was very full, and who had a huge clasp knife in one hand and a pound or two of beef in the other.
"Captain Dave, where are we to paddle over with them horses?"
"We'll see about it," answered the chief. "Someone must go over to scout first. I expect the brutes will be a nation deal safer when they get into Missouri and out of sight of the river."
These words were a revelation. The General pressed my elbow.
"They're horse thieves, mister."
This announcement of the quality of our unconscious hosts was by no means calculated to dissipate my apprehensions. I listened, nervously enough, to an animated debate which now ensued among the members of the gang as to the propriety of hurrying over the stolen horses to the Missouri shore, or of lying concealed for some days until the first fury of the pursuers should be baffled and spent. Opinions varied. The only person of the male sex who took no part in the argument was the old farmer-looking man whom I had heard addressed as Mr. Stone. He sat quiet, having finished his meal and resumed his pipe, and we could see nothing but his respectable-looking gray head and the silvery wreaths from his soapstone meerschaum, inasmuch as his face was toward the outer door. Mrs. Stone, his better half, took an active part in council, urging a stay on the island since there had been "nothing but scurrying here and stampeding there for weeks,
and her darters were worrited and worn out with it."
It was curious, but this notable woman's character appeared little if at all changed by lawless companionship and outlaw life. In the midst of robbers she was still the shrewish, hard-working housewife, and I could see no remorse written on her parchment cheeks. With her daughters it was different. The eldest was evidently melancholy and ill at ease. She sat a little apart, never replied save with a monosyllable to any remark or rough compliment, and her downcast eyes and colourless face told of regrets and scruples that her mother did not share. The younger girl showed the same mental condition, but in a minor degree. Her answers were short but pert, and she occasionally exploded into a giggle at some jocular sally of the Massachusetts man or the German, who were the wit of the assembly. But one glance from her sister's sad dark eyes checked her rising spirits, and she subsided into gloom again. We listened with considerable interest to a discussion which materially affected our safety, but over which we could exercise no influence whatever. We gathered from the discourse that another hut existed, not far off, which was assigned to the Stone family, but that the rest of the association had no residence on the island save the log house in which we were concealed, and no couches but those heaps of brush and flowering grasses on which we were growing fearfully uneasy. The horses, we also learned, were hidden hard by, in a cache dug where the scrub grew thickest, and which was effectually masked from careless eyes by a sort of broad trap-door of osier work and sassafras boughs. Here it was customary to conceal them. They were all stolen from owners in Tennessee, until an opportunity occurred for transporting them to Bolivar or Greenville in Missouri, where certain accomplices of the band resided, and whence they were sent to St. Louis to be sold to immigrants bound for California. Very unwillingly did we thus acquire possession of the secrets of those desperate men, every fresh admission or unguarded word serving to increase our danger, until at last we heard with dismay the final award of Black Dave, the captain.
"We'll just stop. This location's good, and nobody knows of it," we trembled. "And as Marmstone says, the gals are tiresome, and we'd all be better of rest. So we'll just keep close for a few days, and then absquatulate with the horses and scurry for Bolivar."
There was a growl of assent, overtopped by the shrill voice of Mrs. Stone, who clamorously expressed her approval. I glanced at the general's face. It was white but firm, and the compressed lips and brightening eye told of a new resolve.
"It's a bitter pill, sir, 'tis, but we must gulp it,"
he whispered.
"We must give ourselves up, and the sooner the better. It will go harder with us if we were found cached than if we come out bold."
This was logical but startling. I demurred for an instant, suggesting the possibility of our making our way out at the back of the cabin by cutting a hole with our knives in the comparatively thin roof. But our deliberations were unexpectedly cut short. Up to this time the party had contented themselves with eating and reposing, but now a huge can of water and some lemons and sugar and some fresh sprigs of mint were produced, and the cry was set up for whiskey.
"Where did you stow away the stone jars with the Monongahela, Marmstone?"
Mrs. Stone replied that the jars were "under the brush of the beds," and bade the Massachusetts man fetch them. He rose at once, took up a pine torch, lighted it, and advanced. "Now," cried Jeremiah, rising to his feet, and we both stepped out into the lighted circle, causing the startled bearer of the torch to drop the blazing brand in his surprise.
"Doggone it all!"
yelled one of the gang.
"The Philistines are on us!"
With wild shouts and curses the ruffians scrambled up and clutched their weapons.
"Hurroo, boys! It's only two spy varmints!"
thundered Black Dave, who was really a bold villain.
"Kern back, you down east coward, you! And you Dutch cur," for the Massachusetts man and the German were already in full retreat, "they air but two and without weapons." When they were certain of this last reassuring fact, the more timorous of the robbers became almost beyond restraint in their bloodthirsty fury. Pistols and bowie knives menaced us on every side, and it was with some trouble that the captain prevented our summary extermination. Black Dave, however, was firm. By his orders our wrists were tightly bound together with handkerchiefs, and we were placed in the center of a circle of hostile faces and threatening revolvers, and bidden to confess. "Speak up, ye skunks! Who air ye?"
In answer to this query, the general gave a succinct and graphic account of the steamboat accident, of our escape and immersion, of our landing on the island, and of how we happened to fall asleep in the log house and become the involuntary auditors of the robbers' council, though this point was rather lightly touched upon. A bellow of fierce incredulity answered this statement.
"Cut out the lying snake's tongue!" bawled one. "Murder them both, the oily-spoken slipper-skin Yankee eels!" cried another, flourishing his glittering knife within an inch of my nose, while two pistol-bearers were pressed to the forehead of the unflinching Jeremiah. "Hold a bit, gentlemen," said Black Dave. "Out with the truth, ye skulking crawlers! Who sent you? Are ye state police or mere informers? You, specially, with the Connecticut phiz and satin waistcoat. Haven't I seen your ugly features before? What's your name?" "I dare say you have seen me before. I am General Jeremiah Flint of New England, and I ain't ashamed of parentage nor raising," replied the general. There was a murmur. 3 or 4 of those present knew the general by repute or by sight. The Massachusetts man observed that Flint was a hypocrite that passed for doing things on the square. The German abused him for a shelm who had ill-treated an acquaintance of his at Memphis, which accusation afterwards resolved itself into the fact that Flint had broken the arm of a bully who tried to gouge him. 2 other men had heard Flint was a cute chap, and had been soft-hearted enough to help more than one person they had known, and who had been ruined and half-starved in the South. All this time Black Dave, with an ominous frown on his dark brows, had stood toying with the lock of his revolver, making the hammer play up and down between his strong fingers, and tapping the bullets that lay in each charged chamber. Presently he fixed his keen eyes on the steady eyes of the principal captive. I say principal because I attracted little or no attention, being quite unknown. "Last time we met," said Dave deliberately, "you and me, Jeremiah Flint, you sat on the bench along with the sheriff and the squires, and I stood in the dock. Now times are altered. I am judge now, and by all that's earthly I'll have justice. You say you're no spy. That may be true. But how if we let you go to the next town?"
"You'll never be such a tarnal fool, Captain," said a bystander. I took the opportunity of eagerly and solemnly assuring the outlaw that he had nothing to fear from our indiscretion. We would be silent until silence could no longer be necessary.
"Shut your mouth, Britisher," said Dave roughly, and instantly resumed. "General, you must die. It goes agin me to kill in cold blood, but it's our law, and unless we'd all be strung up to trees by the regulators of Tennessee, we must silence you for certain."
Dave lifted his pistol and pointed it at the forehead of poor Flint, who gave a slight shudder and then stood firm.
"I'll settle the other sneak,"
said a brawny boatman, cocking his revolver and grasping my collar.
"I'll count 20, slow," said Dave. "If you've got religion, you can mumble a prayer, and you too, Britisher, for when I get to 20, I crook my claw." The boatsman's pistol was pressed to my ear.
The muzzle felt icy cold, like the touch of death's hand. My arms were bound, and all resistance impossible.
"One,"
began Dave. The face of Old Stone was contorted for a moment, as by a twinge of pain, and he let his pipe go out unheeded, but said nothing. The girls were sobbing in a corner, and Mrs. Stone was apparently urging them in a whisper to withdraw. The robber captain continued to count.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Such a scream! Mary Stone broke from her mother, who sought to detain her, threw herself on her knees at Black Dave's feet, and began to beg our lives with an incoherent energy and a passionate sobbing and outpouring of words that it was painful to hear. This girl, usually so quiet and depressed, was now fully roused by the horror of the cruel deed about to be done. She wept and clung to Dave's brawny arm and supplicated for mercy, mixing her entreaties with broken scriptural phrases and incautious censures of the lawless life and pursuits of the band. But the chief, though startled, was not softened. He shook off the weak hands that grasped his.
"Marmstone, take off your darter, and leave me to settle accounts with the spy. Men ain't to be twisted round like milksops by a useless screeching gal. You've made me lose my count, young one, but I'll pick it up by guess. 12!"
But scarcely had he leveled the weapon when Mrs. Stone advanced and boldly beat it down. "I've been a-puzzling my brains," said the virago, "to recollect the men, and if he's him, I think he shan't die. None of your ugly frowns at me, Cap. Bessie Stone's not the woman to be frightened by black looks. Warn't you Jeremiah Flint, once the actuary chap of the Boston Air Gas Life and Fire Company?"
"Yes, I was,"
said Flint.
"Of course,"
sneered the German maliciously. "We'll prove that," returned Mrs. Stone. "'Tis long years agone, but can you remember going to a village nigh Lexington to see a farmhouse and barns belonging to a farmer that had been burnt out, and the company suspected 'twar done a purpose and were shy to pay the policy thing?"
"Stay a moment," said Flint, pondering. "The farmer's name was Burke, and the village was Brentsville, Mass."
"All right!" screamed the audacious virago, positively wrenching the revolver from between Dave's murderous fingers. "One good turn deserves as good, and as sure as my name's Bessie Stone, and was Bessie Burke, the man that saved my old dad from being ruined root and branch, shan't be shot dog fashion, and you, Stone, if you're a man, you'll say so too." The old farmer, who had evidently the highest reverence for his wife's judgment, rose from his seat, picked up the rifle that had lain beside him, and composedly sounded the barrel with the tough ramrod.
"The bit of lead's in its place,"
he said in his phlegmatic way, and stood still but ready for action. A violent quarrel ensued. Oaths, threats, and hard words were freely bandied to and fro, but four of the least villainous looking of the gang took the side of mercy, and Mrs. Stone's dictum obviously carried great weight with it. Her bitter tongue and the masculine energy of her character, coupled with the respect habitually paid to females in America, had made her a potentate in the association, while her husband, though slow of wit, was known to be a brave man and a first-rate judge of a horse. The end of the matter was that our lives were spared, but that it was decided that we should be kept prisoners until the evacuation of the island. We were accordingly placed in a sort of underground magazine, where forage was stored, and within a few inches of the pit in which the horses were concealed, and to which access was obtained by a drawbridge of stout planking. Our bonds were slackened, but not removed, and we were made to give our parole not to attempt to escape until the horse thieves should quit the island. Mrs. Stone, to whose capricious gratitude we owed our lives, was not unkind to us in her rugged way, and she and her daughters supplied us with food and blankets, and sometimes deigned to descend and converse with us, besides lending us one or two well-thumbed books, which constituted the family library. In the course of these conversations the apparent enigma of the connection between the Stones, who seemed decent folks, and the utter villains who composed the gang, was solved. Old Stone had been a hard-working farmer in Illinois, illiterate, but respectable and honest in deed and thought. Unluckily he had invested his hard-earned savings and the price of his own farm in the purchase of a tempting bargain of landed property with a fatal flaw in the title. The knavish vendor had fled, and the honest dupe, assailed by a lawsuit, had been stripped of all and had found himself a beggar. Unhappily Mrs. Stone was a woman of strong will and a warped and one-sided judgment. She passionately declared that as the law had robbed them of their earnings, the law was their enemy, and a mere device for oppression. Anger blinded her. She was ashamed to live poor where she had been well-to-do, and in the cities of the South the exiled family soon picked up associates whose whole life was one war with society. It was impossible to make Mrs. Stone comprehend that she was really a transgressor in sharing the perils and profits of wholesale plunder. She had got to regard all judges, governors, lawyers, and men of reputed honesty as rogues in league to pillage the simple, and she considered the work in which the horse thieves were engaged as reprisals and warfare. Her husband, long used to obey the shrewd and violent woman who had attained such dominion over him, only saw through his wife's eyes. I believe the couple had some vague idea of buying land in Oregon or California and setting up on the square when they should be rich enough, a hope which has lured on many a half-reluctant criminal. The daughters, on the other hand, less prejudiced and better taught, since they had picked up some instruction of a tolerable school in Chicago, saw nothing but misery and degradation in the companionship to which they were condemned. They passed their lives in sighing over the old days and the innocence of their life in Illinois, and never willingly exchanged a word with the outlaws.
"I'll tell you what, Mr. Barham," said the General to me one day, "I'd like to give a lift out of the mire to them Stones. They've saved the lives of us both for gospel truth, and my heart aches to think of their being caught one day, the old man hung, the woman locked up for life, and the daughters driven out to come to want or worse. I'm not rich, no more, I suspect, are you, but land's not dear up in Oregon, nor yet in California, and between us we might buy 'em a farm, and let 'em live honest, and repent when the grace was born in upon 'em. A farm would be just heaven to 'em, and $3,000 would buy a stock in it a small way."
I willingly agreed, and we quietly settled with Mary Stone, who was wild with joy at the idea that a certain sum should be lodged 2 months hence in the Bolivar Bank in her name. She agreed that it was best to communicate this to her mother after the migration of the band. This was soon to occur. We had been prisoners for a fortnight, when one morning we were informed that a general flitting was at hand and our release imminent. With much snorting and trampling the horses were led up from the cache and embarked on board 2 flat boats, which were to be towed across by 2 broadhorns, while a third followed with the rest of the party. Dawn was just breaking, no steamer was in sight, no wreath of filmy wood smoke was on the horizon. Once on the Missouri bank, safety would be easily secured, since the depredations had been confined to Tennessee. We were allowed to come out of our prison and found ourselves, blinking like owls in the daylight, on the margin of the turbid water. The first flat boat, full of horses, was towed off by a broadhorn pulling 6 oars. The 2 girls and their father were in the stern sheets, But Mrs. Stone lingered, lest the German or Black Dave might do us, as she said, a mischief at parting. But the captain was in good humor. He patted us on the back, laughing heartily, and advised us to "stick to Broadway pavement and Philadelphia Park onst we got there." The last horses were embarked, and the rowers of the Broadhorn settled themselves on the benches and grasped their oars.
"All aboard! Quick, boys!" "Stay," said Black Dave, looking round. "Where's that Massachusetts bird?" Nobody knew. One said he was in the first boat, another denied this. No one had seen him since the previous evening. Black Dave ground his teeth and muttered a deep curse. "He's deserted, the cur, to git the reward them regulators offered."
"He's stole the third Broadhorn. It's gone!"
cried a panting scout, running up. There was a moment of suspense, then a rush, and the remaining boat was so crowded that it was sunk gunwale deep in the water. The captain, rifle in hand, stood up in the stern sheets.
"Pull, all! I hear the dip of oars!"
Flash went the 6 oars into the water, and off went the heavily laden boat, towing the flat with the horses. The progress was necessarily slow. But a few yards had been gained before a loud outcry proved that the island was invaded. We were still standing on the shore, waving our hands to Mrs. Stone, whose hard face had relaxed into a smile and who seemed heedless of the danger.
"Hurrah! Bang at 'em, boys! There the villains are!"
bawled 50 voices, and a crowd of armed men in gaily fringed hunting shirts or homespun suits, well armed, came at a run through the bushes. "Down!" cried Flint, throwing me to my knees and stooping himself just in time to escape death as the rifle balls whizzed over us. I looked up. I saw Black Dave drop on his knees, fire his gun, rise again, stagger, and finally roll over into the river, mortally wounded by the discharge. No one else was hit. Cutting the tow rope and crouching down as much as possible, the outlaws managed to escape further harm, and, abandoning their plunder, reached the Missouri shore. We were at first roughly handled, and were even in some danger of being promptly hanged or shot by order of Judge Lynch, when 2 witnesses to character came forward. One, on whom we looked with disgust, was the treacherous scoundrel who had betrayed the rest of the gang for gold. The other, wonder of wonders, was Ned Granger, who caught me in his arms and hugged me like a bear.
"Dear Ned, I thought you were dead."
"That's exactly what I thought of you, Barham, dear old boy, and of the General there. No, I was very little hurt, and was able to help the other uninjured passengers in caring for those poor creatures who were scalded or torn by the explosion. Every house is like a hospital. Ah, it was a shocking business. But though unhurt, you see, I had lost my luggage and money in the crash, and this honest farmer here has taken care of me these last weeks. So I came to help him to get back his stolen nags, little thinking whom I should find on island number 10. Flint and I kept our word with Mary Stone. End of Wrecked on Island number 10 by Anonymous. Read by Tavarish.